remember
Yeah.
seeing that, and when I saw your name on the list with the Miami Book Fair, it's like, oh yeah. But I hadn't read your book yet.
Okay.
And then I read your book, and I was like, holy mother.
Thank you very much.
I'm wondering at what point the title attached to the book.
Yeah, so I started with the poem "Contemporary American Poetry," right? Which in a way is a critique of some of the petty ambition and careerism that exists in the world of poetry.
Right.
So I was thinking about titling the book that, but my publisher and I were worried that doing so would confuse shoppers, right? That people would think that it's either a critical text or a very, very short anthology. So we played with some ideas, and the idea finally came to me to spell it with K's instead of C's, right? And then there were, a few other meanings that revealed themselves to me after that. But the initial reason was to make it clear that this was a creative work.
And really, I mean, to me, the poems are spectacular. But
Thank you.
as a reference going forward to folks who want to know how to make poetry their own, this is priceless.
Thank you so much.
When you start with what, on confessionalism, and you put the confession back into confessionalism. I remember when I first started writing, my mentor said, "You're the most solipsistic writer I've ever met," and that's kind of the center of. Of course, I said thank you. That's kind of the center of confessionalism. But this poem's just. Can you talk a little about the genesis of it?
Yeah. So it's based on a true life event. The interesting thing, and I'll start before even the poem. There's the epigraph, right, from Larry Levis, where and Henry Dumas, so where Larry Levis says, let me see. I know this isn't much, but I wanted to explain this life to you, even if I had to become over the years someone else to do it. And they have a second epigraph from Henry Dumas that says, "You're lying," said memory. "You're asleep," said forgetfulness. So one of the things I was interested in exploring in this book was the way memory changes over years, right? And our role in certain events in our lives and how those events shape us, but also how our perception and the self that we've created in those events, right, changes us as well. And then how we change it over the years. So that particular poem was based, in a true event, but also I'm also playing with this notion of machismo, and how I've retold that story many times over the years.
Right. The choices that you make in telling the story. I know you regularly introduce your poems by saying, "I write these really long poems," but when you're reading them, we get so caught up in it that we don't have that feeling of,
Okay.
you know what I mean?
Yes, that's good to know.
But the techniques that you're using, how do you communicate that the young man is not as experienced in the world as he'd like to be? Well, by saying, the homeboy said it was a Beretta,
Right.
that kind of stuff. But then you've got this great power of bringing in these witnesses. I mean, the recurring witness is the damn flower in the pot. You bring that in a couple of times. Is that like your instinct? Is that deliberate? How does that work for you?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because, again, when I'm looking at that incident, there is a woman who was watering a plant nearby, and I remember just feeling the whole world. You remember that? I don't know if you're old enough, if you're on my age. You remember the old E.F. Hutton commercials?
Okay.
Yeah, where, somebody walks in the room and then everything just stops and kind of,
Yes.
yeah. It was one of those moments where I just felt, the woman was staring, the flower was staring, so that image in the poem is, although not literal in the literal sense, but it was very literal to the way I perceived that moment at the time.
Okay. So
Yeah.
there's this narrowing of the two main actors, the two main witnesses, and that's it. The scene's contained with that.
Yes. Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
just incredible.
Thank you so much.
And of course, the ending is the ultimate calling out of, yeah, you really don't know what you're doing, do you? In terms of talking about the actions of the narrator. Then you take on Elizabeth Bishop. God bless you. So I go back and I read one art, and then I read this, and it's like, okay, well, I have a preference. We'll move on. Anybody who reads this book and doesn't look at everyone you refer to, you know what I mean? The two epigraphs sent me to, the shooting death of Henry Dumas. Upon reading that Eric Dolphy transcribed, takes me to him being left to die in a hospital because somebody assumed he's a junkie.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, every time you mention someone, it drives me to find out more about them, because I know how layered this book is.
Yeah. Well, if I could just say thank you for that, right? I've been having conversations with other poets recently about difficulty in poetry, right? And the truth of the matter is, depending on how closely you look at a poet or their work, you can make it as difficult as you like. And by difficult, I mean, finding those second and third layers, the nuances, right? But the problem is, I think often people assume, right, the same way, that the doctors assume that this was just a junkie laying here. People will look at a certain artist's work and just assume there's nothing there, that there is only the surface, right? So I just want to thank you for doing the work to make those connections.
Well, shame on them.
Yeah.
As anybody who gets in, as soon as I encounter the word flail in that poem, I know it's going to come back, and it's going to come back, and it's going to come back, and each time I'm going to be like, oh, you're back. It's just, it's how you construct these things, and it's just absolutely wonderful. I won't even go into what you do in the lamentation section. The readers need to see that. But damn. But you start with the sparrows, then your mother's the sparrows, then the swans enter the picture, and then all hell breaks loose. Just absolutely wonderful. Dolores Navy. I grew up in a house with an alcoholic, abusive, child molester dad and an enabling mother. Okay. So I'm reading this poem and it's like, oh, somebody finally wrote this. It's just incredible, the nuance. Can you talk a little bit about, writing this?
Yeah, it took a few years to get to and to get through writing it. And in this poem, as in several others, I blended a few narratives. You know, there were poems. I grew up in a house also with an alcoholic, abusive father. Um, you know, and I've made several attempts to write about that. And he shows up, yeah, as you know, in several poems. Um, and there was a girl. There was a girl who um, neighborhood lore had it that she had been molested by her father until she wasn't. And then there's the geography of this and the time, you know. Um, and then the coyote that appears in the poem came out of nowhere. It was, you know, I remember one time when I was a child, I used to take a long walk to school and crossing some railroad tracks and seeing a dead coyote, and I'd pass him every day, and every day he'd decompose a little bit more until by the end of the school year he was nothing but little matted fur and bones there. And I remember trying to work that into a poem and being very unsuccessful. So, you know, somewhere along the line when I was drafting the poem, all these things converged and, you know, made a whole. I have a buddy of mine, DJ Renegade, poet, who says, a poem is a half lie used to tell the whole truth.
Yes. Yes.
So, you know, in kind of compiling these different narratives into this one poem, I was no longer true to facts, but the poem felt a lot more honest than anything I had written up to that point. And you know, it's interesting. It's one of my favorite poems in the book because it feels so honest, and I really feel like I was able to hit a note that I've been trying to hit for years.
And it's got such range. I mean, it starts almost like Edgar Allan Poe, you know. I've never spoken to anyone about this, and it's like, oh man. But you have these wonderful moments in many of the poems. In Eric Dolphy, where you just turn to the reader and say, I know you thought this was about flowers, but just stay with me. And then in this poem, you've got that, which is to say, and then it's just a wonderful technique. And the thing, a lot of poets would stop before you stop. That's what I like about your poetry. A lot of poets, as soon as they think they've hit that first hit, they say, I'm done, move on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But you come back to the butterflies are now dead too, and the ants are now dead too. It's just, you stay with the story.
Yes.
You know
Yes,
what I mean? And
absolutely.
how do you come by that? I mean, is that just something you learned over time, or?
I think it has a lot to do with my primary influences. You know, I'm leaning heavily in all the work, but especially in this book on Larry Levis, right? Levis and I also shared a teacher and influence in Philip Levine. You know, so there's that, right? Um, but also, you know, some more contemporary examples. I'm thinking of like the poet Ross Gay, right? As someone who writes these really long, digressive poems, and allowing himself these digressions, right, takes the reader on something of a journey, right? And, you know, matter of fact, I don't know if you had a chance to read his newest book, Ross Gay. It's called Beholding. And the poem begins with this move, and I think it was 1980 or 1979, where Dr. J was playing against the Lakers, and he leaped, or leapt rather, on the right side of the rim and hung in the air for a while and did a reverse layup on one of the most beautiful shots in the history of basketball. So he hung in the air for, you know, what seemed like, you know, at least 3 or 4 seconds. So in Ross's book, this is a book-length poem that begins with the leaping of Dr. J in the air, and then it becomes this book-length meditation on flight, on African-American history, on fatherhood, on all these things. And he's doing it by way of all these digressions. And these things happen for pages and pages and pages before Julius Irving lands. So, I'm really intrigued by that technique because it allows you, again, digressions, it allows you thought, expansion, a lot of these things. And also, to go back to some techniques you're mentioning, what I was interested and I'm always interested in is writing poems that can exist on the page and in the air. So when I think of the poets whose work I enjoy most in the air, it's not that they're necessarily great performers, but their poems, you get a sense that they're speaking to someone, right? So to me, it's the equivalent of making eye contact. So in the poems, when I'm saying things like "stay with me" or what have you, it's a way to check in with the reader to keep them engaged the whole way through.
Right. I made the mistake of saying to Roske, "Oh yes, I opened this book and I go, oh my God, a basketball poem." But then of course, you can't get very far into the book before you dispossess yourself of that idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, Elizabeth Acevedo read her wonderful Rat Ode and gave a wonderful introduction. And then the next day, somebody stood up and in order to compliment the people reading that day, felt it necessary to say, not like the ghetto poetry of last night. And it's like,
Wow.
No.
Oh man.
Yeah. And I don't know, do you run into that or are you reading in safe places? Are you reading in places where you have to deal with that crap? Or
I don't, I would say no, I don't. Yeah, and I would have to know more about the context. I'm not sure what the person meant by ghetto poetry.
they didn't mean anything nice.
Yeah. But I'll tell you this. I long ago, how do I say this? With my first book, right, I did worry that in writing about things that happen in let's call it urban America, that I was fulfilling and maybe even perpetuating certain stereotypes, right? In my poems, there are guns, there's basketball, there's sex, a lot of the things that people associate with, people of color, in particular inner city people of color. But I can't write, at least, from writing from experience and memory, those things exist. And I write for those who will read me. Yeah. And I write for whoever is willing to listen. And, people are going to come to the page, to the auditorium with their prejudices intact. Yeah. And I don't really feel I could be responsible for changing any of that. I write the poems that I can write and see what they'll do. So I don't know. It's yeah.
I mean, I can easily say that the first time I saw Patricia Smith, she changed my writing life. 2005, she's appearing with, the quote, big names. And, she's famous for telling the story how, she comes into the room and they're all acting like she's there to take their order for coffee, that kind of crap.
Yeah.
But, if anything, she taught me that whole stiff upper lip American English poetry was kind of bullshit. And there was another way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even
several ways, yes, and that's the beauty of it, right? I remember watching an interview with Phil Levine, and I think it was from maybe he was reading from The Simple Truth, so maybe it was the early '90s, and was commenting on the state of contemporary American poetry, contemporary American poetry back then. And one of the things he was saying was, it's so diverse now. You have so many different voices coming in, Black voices, Chicano voices, urban voices, desert voices. And he felt that it was something that was healthy for poetry. And I would agree, not just because, coming from, a different direction, but also we're writing American poems. And I think part of the reason we get into the trouble that we do, I'm thinking politically now, and given what's going on right now, right, in the world, goes back to something Lucille Clifton said. She said once that, the problem is that, no, she says, children need windows and mirrors, right? And the problem is that some children grow up with only windows and some children grow up with only mirrors. And I see now we have an administration and support for an administration wherein most people involved have grown up with only mirrors. And, in my writing, depending on people's perspective, where they're coming from, hopefully these poems can serve as both, right? Mirrors for those who need them and windows for those who need them as well.
I really appreciate this, and have a blessed day.
Thanks for having me. You too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.